Welcome back, everyone, to the Financial Philosophers Podcast. Danny and I are really excited to introduce a special guest on today's episode. We are speaking with Stephen Weisberg. He's the lead tax attorney at the W Tax Group, which is a full service attorney based tax resolution company. And they specialize in helping clients resolve IRS and state tax liabilities. And it's a really fascinating topic. We're super excited to have you. Stephen, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Appreciate it. I'm glad to be here.
Yeah, I just wanted to jump right in because this is a topic Danny and I have not covered, and when you reached out to us
Good.
to see about having a conversation, it was exciting because one of the things we like to do on the podcast, in addition to financial literacy, is just empower people to be able to navigate the financial hardships that they are inevitably going to face during their life at some time. One of those hardships
Exactly.
could be trip ups with the tax system, forgetting
Yeah.
things, falling behind, whatever it might be. And we
Right.
like to equip people to not be anxious and reduce anxiety and know that there are people out there who can help them, in those situations.
Exactly.
So, yeah, I wanted to jump in and I think the first question that came to mind is, just briefly talk about maybe what you do and what are some of the common problems you run into with clients.
Sure. I'm an attorney. I started in corporate bankruptcy. I was really trying to, help kind of your everyday, small business, medium-sized business, entrepreneurs. I started corporate bankruptcy, like I said, and I was out here in Detroit. So I felt like I was basically helping like the big three, Chrysler, Ford, and GM, and I wanted to do something a little bit different where I could see the difference I was making on a daily basis, because it seemed like I was only helping those big corporate behemoths in what I was doing. So, over 10 years ago now, I started doing tax debt resolution, and tax controversy work where I like I said I'm able to help small businesses and entrepreneurs and those who are self-employed when they get into a problem with tax debt. And so no one really wants to hear from me, no one really wants to talk to me, but it happens. And especially with those who are self-employed and have their own business, it happens. And when you get there, it is nerve-wracking, it makes people anxious, but I am here to help. um, and I pride myself on being able to do that. So, the main things that I come up on is tax debt. That's number one. So, especially for those who are, like I said, self-employed small businesses, it's not like you have a paycheck where you're getting, every 2 weeks a paycheck, and your employer is taking money out of your paycheck, and so that creates the problem right there. Everyone kind of thinks like, oh, maybe I'll pay this bill and that bill, and I won't make my quarterly payment each quarter to the IRS, and I'll just make it up on the back end. And then they get to April 15th and they realize, oops, I don't have enough money to pay my tax bill. So, that's where I come in. That's number one. And that's really, I certainly, I do improper tax assessments by the IRS as well, where the IRS says you owe a certain amount and you disagree. I work with audits, but most of my work has to do with tax debt, whether it's income tax debt, business income tax debt, or payroll income tax, or sorry, payroll tax debt, that businesses find themselves in.
Oh, wow, that's so interesting. And Uh, do you find most of these issues cropping up more so on like the small business side of things, or do you also see individual taxpayers running into tax issues? Is there kind of like a skew one way or the other?
Well, yeah, I mean, I would say it's kind of all one and the same, meaning like, with an S corp, it's all flowing through to the individual. If you just have a Schedule C, same thing, individual. And then if you're working for yourself, well, I guess if you're working for yourself, you have the Schedule C as well. So it's kind of all one and the same. The business side of it that I do a lot of work in is with payroll tax, and that's where businesses
Interesting.
have employees,
Mm,
and they're taking taxes out of their paychecks, let's say biweekly, and they're supposed to be depositing that money into with the IRS. There are times, more so than you might realize, where businesses take the money that they took from the employees checks, and they use it to pay a vendor or something, because a vendor is saying like, hey, you can't we're not gonna deliver, goods or whatever you need without you giving us the money, and again, business owners say, "Oh, I'll make it up when cash flow is better." It's whatever the reasons are, and they get themselves into trouble, and then there's a personal liability aspect to that too. So the two, like I said, small businesses, Schedule C, all that kind of stuff, is a big deal in terms of the individual tax that and the payroll tax that on the business side.
Gosh.
Do you find that tax debt, and getting into those problems
Mhm.
and those issues, kind of cropping up is more common with new businesses or companies, that may not be using bookkeepers?
Well, certainly, when they're not using bookkeepers for sure. I don't necessarily know that it's new businesses.
Okay.
It kind of runs the gambit of new businesses to old businesses, but you're right. I think you're kind of alluding to it's businesses that don't have kind of all their ducks in a row, and maybe don't have a bookkeeper, and maybe haven't figured out how to make consistent deposits to make sure that they're actually paying the IRS, or whatever it may be. You need to have those types of systems in place and make be consistent with what you're doing in order to make sure that you're paying your taxes.
That is so interesting. When you were talking, I just started thinking of like, the typical small business owner. Maybe it's just a sole proprietor, somebody who's just working for themselves, right? And they've been accustomed to having their employer, if they used to be a W-2 wage employee, they would just account for taking
Right.
all the taxes out, and also the payroll taxes, like the Social Security and Medicare tax, right? And like I could see
Mhm.
that being so easy to just slip up on and forget that, oh wow, I don't just have my marginal federal income tax bracket, I also have my payroll taxes, Social Security and Medicare, that could be so easy to forget to account for those as part of what you need to be paying for the taxes. I could see now just an easy path how even somebody who is unsuspecting and has the good intentions, the right intentions, could easily fall behind on something like that.
Right, and that's, like, kind of the case, like you said, with maybe new businesses, they don't realize that they have that responsibility.
Yeah. Yeah, what are thinking about the breadth of tax issues that you see clients facing, what are some just best practices that people can start thinking about to help mitigate some of those potential issues? Like, what are just some good habits they could be baking in to their financial processes and things like that?
Sure, I mean, I think for sure if you're a small business, um, and just bringing into what we're talking about right now is, you have to understand what you actually owe for each year. So you do need some advice, and you want to have a good um, advisor, who not isn't just doing your tax prep, but also is kind of advising you to let you know, like, how calculate the taxes that you owe, and all that, so you actually know what you're doing. At the same time, my other really only other advice is, you want to automate as much as possible,
Mm,
because with the paycheck, when you're an employee, like, that's automated, right? All
mhm,
those taxes come out of your paycheck, so it's easy. So if you can come up with a process by which, any income that comes in, that whatever the number is, let's just say 30% for right now, 30% has to go into another account that ultimately is going to be paid to the IRS on a quarterly basis. You want to make sure that you do that, and make it as automated as possible, so you don't really even have to think about it.
mm,
That that is something that we are big proponents of, is automating every aspect
Right.
of your financial life, as much as possible. It relieves so much of the headache and stress that you can encounter.
yeah,
Exactly,
I
exactly. It's
agree.
too hard otherwise.
Yeah, and I just keep thinking about the example you gave earlier about how, just punting off the issue, right? Like, oh, I should be withholding some money and paying my quarterly taxes, but I also have to pay this vendor or this whatever this my business
Mhm.
expense, and I'll make up for it at the end of the year. I'm almost imagining that like that's just truly the wrong way to be thinking about it. It's like your taxes should be treated the same, if not even of greater priority, as a line item expense that must be paid, like the rent that you have to pay for your commercial
Mhm.
lease or whatever. That it seems like this just needs to be like a reprioritization for maybe for some people to be thinking about that. But
Yeah,
yeah,
I mean, it really should be. Oh, sorry, I'm just gonna say it really should be number 1, but, the IRS your landlord is telling you every month, "Hey, you gotta pay me," whereas the IRS isn't necessarily saying that every month, they're only saying it once a year. That's why
Yeah,
that
they're not knocking on your door on the weekly trying to demand that you pay the tax liability.
Yeah.
exactly.
So,
Only one annual reminder, but it's a very, very important reminder.
Right,
yeah.
right, exactly.
Yeah, therein lies the dilemma though, right? If it's out of sight, it's out of mind for a lot of people, right? And so maybe
Yeah.
that's part of this conversation is to just raise the awareness for the listeners that don't forget about this really crucial aspect. Um, yeah, I am curious, Stephen, when it comes to that moment when somebody finds out, uh-oh, I have to do something now. I'm either getting audited or I'm getting a notice or a letter from the IRS. How does that typically happen? Like how does somebody generally find out that they have a tax issue or that something is on the horizon they have to deal with? And then what do you recommend somebody does? Kind of the first thing they should do when they realize they have something they have to deal with?
Yeah, I mean, you'll start getting letters from the IRS, pretty shortly thereafter. If you, let's say for 2024, if you aren't able to make payment on April 15th, you'll get letters in the next couple months that'll start to let you know. One of the main problems is, people, they they don't want to believe it, or they don't want to deal with it, or they just kind of want to stick their heads in the sand and just kind of pretend it's not happening. So a lot of people do that, and those first notices, it's going to say you owe us money. It's not going to say like we're going to take money out of your bank account. We're going to garnish your wages. It just says you owe us money, and they get progressively more aggressive
Mm,
down the line. So at first people are like, oh, whatever, it says I owe. Oh well, I'll figure it out again. Figure it out later, whatever. Or I just want to pretend it's not happening and maybe it'll go away or whatever. I mean, people don't think rationally necessarily. Um, but yeah, initially you'll get that letter, and then the letters will keep coming, keep coming. They'll get more progressively, worse, and then you'll get that final notice of intent to levy that says, "Hey, you have 30 days. If you don't answer us within 30 days, we can enforce collections, which means bank levies, wage garnishments, potentially seizure of assets." Which takes longer to get into place, but certainly bank levies and wage garnishments are two of the big ones.
yeah. As you were explaining that kind of cascading effect as things just get progressively worse, right? I can imagine some listeners, even those who don't have a tax issue, right? They're just hypothetically putting themselves in this situation right now, and they're probably getting more and more anxious. So,
Yeah.
what could somebody do, or what should somebody do when they get that first notice? I mean, what are some of the first things people should be doing to just make sure they are addressing it and getting ahead of it?
Yeah, it depends. First thing of all, it depends on where you are in terms of finances.
Hmm.
Obviously, if you're able to pay it, you want to pay it. Um, if you cannot pay it, my advice would be to call a tax professional or a tax attorney like myself to find out what is the best way to go about this. Because if you call the IRS by yourself, the IRS is not trying to help you is the reality. They're trying to get as much money as they can as quickly as they can, and maybe they sound nice on the phone, maybe not. I don't think they sound that nice most of the time, but maybe they sound nice on the phone. The point is, they're not trying to help you. They're not going to tell you what the best ways are for you to resolve this outstanding debt. What's the most favorable way? What's going to save you the most money, or what's going to make it the most reasonable payment plan or resolution for you to move forward. So if you don't have the money to pay, you want to call someone, a tax professional, or like I said, myself, tax attorney, that can help you understand, what options you have moving forward, and what's going to be the best resolution option for you to get the most favorable outcome.
Yeah, that's great advice. And on the resolution side of things, like assuming, like you said, there's kind of two buckets, right? You can either just pay what you owe right then and there, assuming you have the funding available. But I suspect for many people, they got into that situation because they didn't have the funding to begin with. And so they fall into that second bucket, which is we have to figure out some type of solution to handle this. Can you speak to what some of those strategies might be? Like, what options do people generally have on the table when they're working with a tax attorney? Like, what might you help somebody try to achieve with different resolutions?
Sure. And the first thing I would always say to, someone who speaks to me is like, I'm going to be able to resolve your case. You're
Mhm.
not going to be at a point where like you're just going to have to pay the total amount owed right away. I'm going to be able to resolve it one way or the other. It just depends on what that resolution is going to be. So, there certainly are installment agreements,
Mm.
which are basically monthly payment plans where the IRS is going to have you, pay over time. But there's different types of installment agreements, and that's one thing I think people misunderstand. They kind of know in the back of their minds, hey, um, I've heard of these installment agreements or these monthly payment plans. I know the IRS will let me do it, so I'm just going to call my own. But the reality is, there's multiple different kinds depending on your situation and your circumstances. Which one makes the most sense for you? What's the most favorable? There's what's called a partial pay installment agreement, where you may pay something to the IRS on a monthly basis, but you may never end up paying off the total amount of the debt.
Mm.
Um, they do have, what's called like a streamlined installment agreement where you may pay over 72 months, but depending on how much time the IRS has left to collect from you, there might be an alternative way of doing it that might be better. You might want to, provide financials to show what you can afford. There's a lot that goes into it, to make sure you're able to get into a payment plan that makes sense for you. So payment plan, and the different variations of it is certainly, one of those resolutions. Um, and the partial pay installment agreement, if you're eligible for it, is a big one because you don't end up paying off the total amount of your debt. There's penalty abatement that's sometimes available. The big one that everyone likes to hear about is the offering compromise. I don't know if you guys have heard, but they're
Mm-mm.
always on the radio saying, "Hey, we can resolve your case for 10% of what you owe." And with the offer and compromise, theoretically, you can do that, and it does happen, but not everyone qualifies for it. So
Mm.
I always bring that up because maybe just because I'm fixated, or I hear, I obviously it's my business, so when I hear those on the radio, I'm my ears are primed for that. But there's a lot of these companies that say, hey, we can resolve it for 10%, and then they don't have, if they don't know anything about your case, they have no idea whether or not they can actually resolve it for 10% of what you owe. But the offering compromise, the bottom line is where you offer a specific amount of money. It's formulaic. There's paperwork that goes into it, and there's a specific way that it's calculated. But you offer the IRS a certain amount of money, to try to resolve the total amount of your debt. So it's possible if you owe $100,000 that maybe you do resolve it for $10,000, but it's certainly not that simple. There's a lot that
Mm.
goes into it. There's formulas, there's paperwork, there's financials, and again, the main thing is not everyone's eligible because what these big tax debt companies, I guess I would call them. Um, they just want to get you in the door and say, hey, we think we can do this, hand this over, whatever it is, $10,000, we'll get it done, and we'll worry about the details later. And then they'll file these offering compromises, and they'll say, oh, well, we tried, it didn't work, but we have done it for other people, it just didn't work for you, which is a bummer, and it's really not great, or not good at all for people who get stuck in that situation. But they're inundated with these like I said, radio commercials and maybe internet ads and stuff, and it's too bad that they get stuck in that.
Sure, they're
Wow.
they're advertising kind of the best case scenario, so that
Right,
that resolution is technically possible, but it's
right,
more realistic to see something somewhere in the middle.
right, exactly.
Wow, that was very enlightening. Hearing you talk about all the different options. It truly, it just solidifies the importance of working with a tax attorney or a tax professional with this stuff because it's a multifaceted issue, right? It's not a one size fits all. There are different options on the table, and it's going to be entirely dependent on what the client's situation is to really
Exactly.
determine what is the most optimal path to take. I think just everything you said is very valuable just to know, like to raise awareness that those things are actually out there. And especially after what you said, I would not want to be the person calling the IRS on my own, thinking that I had any
Right,
sense of how I was going to
yeah,
find a resolution for this. I would definitely want to
right,
work with a professional to optimize that. So I am curious, just as a side question, when you were talking about the installment payments, I'm assuming is there usually, like, an interest charge levied on these payments? Like, is it usually, like, taking on a loan, basically? Like, paying off a loan in some way?
yeah. There's a couple aspects to it. One is yes, there is interest. It's similar to kind of what the interest is out there in the world,
Mm,
generally. So it's not. usurious. It's not something that's a crazy interest. What really is the big problem is the penalties. Um,
Mm,
there's a failure to file penalty, which means, if you haven't filed your return, there's a big penalty. There's a failure to pay penalty, which is another big penalty. And the failure to file penalty and the failure to pay penalty, they're both can go up to 25% of what you owe. So in total, it will be an added 50% of what you owe if you got both of those penalties. So one thing I would say is, there's people who certainly get into issues with the IRS where they can't pay what they owe, and then they don't file their tax return. Well, even if you can't pay what you owe, you still want to file your tax return because again, there's this failure to file penalty, and if you file, you've at least stopped that penalty. That's 25% of what you owe that you've at
Yeah.
least stopped. So even if you can't pay, you want to file that return.
There are even negligence and potential fraud penalties that can be accrued on top of that, correct?
Yeah, those are more specific situations
Okay.
where there's fraud identified, and it's a little bit more, complicated and
mm,
complex, but in terms of you just not owing, that's more of just I mean, I'm sorry, not paying, owing and not paying, that's more of the payment, non-filing, and non-payment penalties.
yeah. So there's the failure to file penalty, the failure to pay penalty. Correct me if I'm wrong, Stephen. Isn't there also the under withholding penalty? Like if you simply just don't withhold enough throughout the year, you can be charged like a penalty. Um,
Yeah, yeah,
when
there is a small penalty, on that, and certainly you don't want to accrue it if you don't have to, but in
sure,
comparison to the failure to file and the failure to pay, it's,
much
peanuts,
lower,
right?
right? Yeah, it's peanuts.
Yeah,
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 um, yeah. Danny and I often kind of tongue in cheek, we joke, but at the same time, we're being serious. We're always looking for like ways to have the biggest return on your investment. And that could be like conceptually like the lowest amount of time you have to spend to get a huge return on investment. And I'm going to take that
yeah,
spin right now. Just filing your tax return, just getting it filed, even if you know you're not gonna be able to pay the tax liability, just doing that is
right,
gonna avoid 25 potentially up to
yeah,
25% penalty.
right,
If there's ever a great return on investment, it's just filing the return. Like,
right,
so
right,
to anybody out there who is dragging their feet or stressed about it, at least get that done.
yeah,
That's huge. I didn't even think of it that way until you were describing
yeah,
it and talking how those
yeah,
penalties can lay on
exactly,
top of one another.
right,
So
and people get scared, so
yeah,
they just say, "Well, I can't pay, so I'm not gonna file."
sure. Like you said, head in the sand, right? It's just easier to
Mhm,
just kind of put the problem off and not wanna
right,
confront it. Gosh,
exactly,
it's so fascinating how much of this issue is also just human psychology, right? There's the
yep,
one side of like not having the funding to actually pay the tax liability you owe, but it's also the human psychology of wanting to avoid the discomfort of having to confront the
yep,
situation you're in. I think with that, like, can you say anything? I don't want to put words in your mouth or make the assumption, but like, is there any words of encouragement? Like, is it? I Do people have to beat themselves up? Like, do you usually see people getting into these situations not because they were being ill-intentioned with things? I'm assuming that these are honest, good people,
yeah,
but they just they trip
right.
up and things like this happen. I don't know. Can you speak to that a little bit? I mean, what do you generally see?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, yeah, it's exactly that. I think 90 I don't know what the word 90%, 95% of the people
Sure.
that come to me, like, they weren't, like, up to no good, right?
Yeah.
They made some decisions where they couldn't afford it, and maybe that's irresponsible, but things happen in life, and everyone does things, and it is what it is. But, yeah, it's more they just didn't have the money, and then they got scared, and they just didn't know what to do. And like we kind of talked about, like it is scary, like especially if you feel like I have to call the IRS on my own, and maybe I can get a resolution, maybe I can't, but I got to call them on my own. I don't know what I don't know, and that's what I always say. People, when you're calling on your own, you don't know what you don't know,
Yeah.
and you've got this big bad IRS that knows all the rules. They've created the rules, and they know what they can do and they can't do, but they're not telling you. So yeah, it's just people they didn't have the money and they just kind of want it to go away. And they're not going to be proactive about getting this resolved, but not being proactive turns into 50% penalties. And so yeah, I would say what you can do to resolve that anxiety is to call someone like me, call a tax
Yeah.
attorney that has expertise, because then you still may be anxious and upset about it, but it's not on you to figure it out. You don't have to worry about like, oh, I need to understand this and I got to call the IRS and it's gonna be scary and they're gonna yell at me and I don't know what the resolutions. You don't have to worry about that. You have someone who's advocating for you that can
Mm,
take it off your plate. You can go back to running your business and being with your family and all of those things that you're good at and that feel good, and you can let someone else who actually knows what they're doing take it over for you, and you can sleep at night as opposed to worrying about how you're going to deal with this.
yeah, that was extremely helpful, and thank you for for sharing your thoughts on that. I think the people hearing that will feel relief knowing that this is not a battle they have to do alone, and that there
Exactly.
is solidarity. There are people who are in this situation, multiple people who are in this situation. So this is not some unique thing that only happens rarely. Like, it's I assume it's
Certainly.
more commonplace than people may realize, right?
Yeah,
It's
it's very common.
yeah,
Very common.
yeah. I, um, I was just thinking about this too as you were talking, about something earlier with, when they get the notice, to from, the IRS. What about the situations where maybe somebody doesn't have, like, the right address up to date with the IRS or something like that? Do you ever see those situations rise where, like, people are missing the notices or the letters, like, they're not getting them? Like, how often does that happen, and what can people do to make sure that doesn't happen?
Well, it does happen. I mean, it happens certainly. You just want to make sure your address is updated with the IRS. So when you're filing your returns, each year when you file your return, whatever address you have on that return, that's going to be the address that they're going to be using. So as long as you've
Gotcha.
updated, your address, your returns each year, they're going to have the right address. But there are people who haven't filed for 10 years, um, and who have accrued, had accrued balances due before that, and now are kind of in hiding, and maybe their address has changed, and then yeah, they're not getting the letters, and that doesn't seem to be a deterrent in terms of like you're not going to be able to like go to court and say, well, I never received service if it was like a lawsuit or something. It's like it doesn't matter that you didn't receive service. Like whatever address they had, they sent it to, and that's all that matters. And that's a big thing about the IRS. The IRS is a big, powerful collections agency. They have so much more power than anyone else out there. So, like, I kind of was talking about you being in like a court case or something. Like, you have a lot of um, ability to say, hey, I didn't get this, I wasn't served properly, I have certain rights, and you do have certain rights to the IRS, but they have so many more rights than any other person that you'd ever be in contact with who'd be in like a courtroom setting. That it's ridiculous, to be honest. And I
Yeah.
mean, think about it, like you can owe, let's just say, $10,000 to the IRS. They don't need to get a judgment or anything in court. If you owe the $10,000, that's the judgment,
Yeah.
and then you owe it, they're able to come after you. That's it.
That's a great point. Wow, this was a very, very enlightening conversation. Danny, did you
Good.
have anything else that you wanted to ask? Because I feel really good about what we just covered.
Yeah, we've definitely covered a lot. I was curious. So, if I have a tax issue and I get that first notice and I reach out to you, what do those next steps look like? Like, what does our initial meeting look like? What's
Mm,
the kind of information gathering process and the next steps?
Yeah, that's a good question
mm,
because what I mentioned, where you hear this on the radio, we're going to resolve your tax for 10 cents on the dollar. Um, and they'll call and say, basically, hand me over money and I'll take care of it. And it never works out that way. So, what I do is I do an initial investigation. It's a kind of, I call it a tax debt analysis. So, I speak to the client, the taxpayer, and I say, look, this is what I'm going to do. I'm going to get a power of attorney for you. And that just is related to the IRS. I'm going to get a power of attorney. I'm going to find out how much you owe, what your penalties are, what your interest is, what collections notices has gone out. I'm going to learn more about you and your finances. I'm going to get an overall picture and understanding of what's going on here. And then we're going to come back to the table after I've gotten all that information and done some analysis, and reason things through. And I'm going to say, look, this is what we're looking at. This is what we can do moving forward, and this is what I would advise you to do moving forward. And then I'll quote you a fee so that we're all on the same page. It's very transparent. We're all on the same page. We understand what I believe we can do. Now, look, I certainly can't guarantee results, but at least I can say this is what I would advise you to do. This is what my plan and strategy would be moving forward, and this is what you'd be paying me for, as opposed to just like I said, just saying, "Hey, we'll take care of it. Just hand me over your money." I like to be very transparent and out in the
Yeah,
open, so we start off from the same place.
Absolutely. We love
that's awesome.
transparency.
Yeah, that is
Yep,
really, really
that's
great. Wow. On that note, Stephen, in case any of our listeners happen to be in that situation or know somebody who is
sure.
in that situation, where can they find you? What's the best way to reach out to you?
I'm very active on LinkedIn, so if you have liner notes, I'm sure my name will be on there. But you can go to Weisberg.tax. It's Weisberg.tax. That's a page where you can get to me directly. There's certainly my company, the W Tax Group. They're at wtaxattorney.com. But if you want to get to me personally, I put that out there so that taxpayers can get to me, personally, can talk to me, can kind of bypass all the other stuff.
Sure.
And so I've set that up separately. So, Weisberg.tax would really be the best place to reach out to me. Or again, if you're on LinkedIn, I'm very active there and I'm very responsive as well.
Awesome.
Great.
Yeah, that's excellent. Stephen, we really, really appreciate your time today and for breaking new ground on a topic we have not covered. This was really, really educational. I'm really glad we were able to bring you on and provide this to our listeners. Just if even at the very least, to raise awareness around
Yeah,
these issues and that there are people who can help. And then
for sure.
potentially to those people who are listening who do need the help, they have a solution now to somebody to reach out to. So really
Exactly.
appreciate your time and your expertise, and thank you so much for joining the show.